Welcome to Overcoming Distractions, the podcast, how to stay focused in business and in life. Each week we interview successful people and experts in a variety of industries, all in an effort to keep you focused on growing your business and career and thriving in life. Distractions are the enemy of greatness, so let's minimize those distractions and set your sights on success. Our topics include money, productivity, developing routines and new habits, and we also have episodes on how to thrive in this world if you're an adult with ADHD. Stay focused, people, and let's get moving. Here's our host, author of the popular book, Overcoming Distractions, Dave Greenwood.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Overcoming Distractions. It's Dave, and I'm really glad you've chosen to hang out with us once again and to listen to the experts that I continue to bring on to the podcast. You know, as I like to say, I'm really selective in who I bring on the podcast because I want you to walk away after listening to this podcast with value and with things that you could put into action in your daily lives. So I really try and strive for that every week, and I really hope you agree. If you do, I'd love for you to hop on, the podcast and give us a great rating and 5-star review. That's all I'll say about that. So anywho, every little bit helps. Anyway, this week I have Dr. Benjamin Chayette on, and we're going to go right back to the basics of ADHD. So maybe you were diagnosed with ADHD, maybe you have ADHD and just want to learn a little bit more about the neuroscience behind ADHD. That's what we're going to do this week. Dr. Benjamin Chayette is also the husband of Sarah Chayette, who we had on a few weeks ago, and we had a great conversation about ADHD and the focused mind. So we spend a lot of time about the what ADHD is, and I know maybe you have a pretty good understanding of what ADHD is, but Dr. Chayette is going to walk us through that. And then we spend a lot of time on dopamine, and in fact, we geek out a little bit on dopamine. He really digs in to what dopamine is, what it does for the brain, how it helps us in our reward system. And I was just absolutely fascinated with his knowledge as well as how he laid it out for all of you. So this is a great conversation, and I asked Dr. Chayette to actually come back because we ran out of time because he was just such a detailed guest. So he's got a wealth of knowledge in this area and brings an incredible amount of expertise. So I'm guessing you're really going to love this podcast. So let's go talk to Dr. Chayette about dopamine, ADHD, and what it takes to actually live the life that you were really built to live. So let's go hang out with Dr. Chayette. All right, we are back, people, and it is another edition of Overcoming Distractions. And I am Dave, your host. If you're new to the podcast, I thank you for downloading the podcast, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to look at all our other past episodes. We really try and dig into the topic of adult ADHD, and we try to be selective in those topics to make sure that we're giving you the value and the tools that you need to better your life. As I mentioned in the introduction, this podcast is being recorded during the coronavirus crisis of 2020, and I know a lot of people kind of go back and download these episodes. So if we're in the year 2021 or 2022 and you're hearing this, just know that it was recorded back then. So we may reference that, we may not. But my guest today is Dr. Ben Chayette, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, but we're really going to go back to ADHD 101, and we're going to dig into that. All right, welcome, Ben, to Overcoming Distractions. How are you?
I'm good.
Great.
I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. And I, as I mentioned, I want to I want to take an opportunity. We've been doing the podcast for a couple of years, but I want to take an opportunity to kind of just go back to ADHD 101 for people and break it down. But before we do that, I would love for you to just introduce yourself and tell us about your practice, the people that you like to work with. So I'm going to give you the floor for a minute or so.
Sure. So I am a general psychiatrist. I have been working in the field for about 20 years now. I worked in academia for a long time. I am a professor emeritus from the University of California, San Francisco. As of 2 years ago, when I went into full-time office practice, seeing patients of all types in psychiatry. As I say, full-time. A substantial portion of my practice is adults with ADHD, although I see many other kinds of patients as well.
Great. So I'm just going to throw out one of the most basic questions there is about this topic, and I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts. And again, I know that you have a really good way of breaking it down, but let's just fire it up. What is ADHD?
Well, one thing that's important to say about ADHD, especially if we're talking to adults, and I know that's where this is geared, is ADHD is a lifelong condition. So it's not something that suddenly appears when you're 30 or 40 or 50. It's something that you've had since you were a kid, although it's possible you may only get diagnosed at a later age. And it can morph a little bit. It may look different at different stages of your life, but the core symptoms are present throughout your life. And the core symptoms really come down to two broad classes of traits. One being a deficit in attention, as the name of the syndrome implies, so inattention. And then the second core set of traits have to do with hyperactivity and or impulsivity, and those two things are grouped together. And so that's the core symptomatology of ADHD. And then, as I said, you can break that down further, and it may change as you age, as your life changes and your circumstances change in terms of how those particular traits are expressed in your life. So it may look a little different when you're a kid in grade school from when you're an adult professional, but the core traits are there throughout your life.
Yeah. And I think you bring up an interesting point, and I know I've discussed this before, and we actually did a couple podcasts on the myths associated with ADHD. But when I was, when I wrote the book and I go out and I do speaking to various, say, business groups or what have you, and somebody would come up to me and they say, "Oh, I used to have ADHD." And I'm thinking, "You used to?" I'm like, "You do. Maybe you've done a really good job at thriving and finding your way in life." But I mean, do you hear that a lot? And I'm glad to hear you kind of reinforce that it is a lifelong condition.
I don't, and it may have to do with the different circumstances of what you do versus what I do. But in my office, I don't usually get people coming in and saying, "I used to have ADHD." What I see more is the opposite phenomenon of people wondering, when they're in their 40s or 50s, if they have ADHD now. And that brings up a separate issue. I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but as I say, I see all types of patients. And now that ADHD is getting a little bit more attention in adults than it once did, I sometimes get people in my office who, frankly, are clearly, to my eyes as a clinician, I can see, and from the way they're describing what's going on, they're depressed.
Yeah.
Or maybe they have an anxiety condition. And those are things that sometimes do suddenly rear their heads when people are 40 or 50 because they're under a lot of stress, something happens in their life, and now they have a major depressive episode, or they have a vast increase in their anxiety. They may have been a little anxious before, but now they're much more anxious, and they have generalized anxiety disorder or even panic disorder. And yet, because of the power of denial, or just their lack of insight into what's going on in their own lives and what it really is, they may come to my office, and when I ask them what's wrong, they may say, well, I'm having difficulties concentrating, I'm having difficulties focusing. And they either say or they imply that they think they have ADHD.
Yeah.
But when I talk to them, it's clear this is something that just started in the last year or two. And prior to that, they never had a problem with attention and focus before. In fact, they may have been extremely accomplished in school or academically, and had no problems sitting still or reading a book until suddenly, as I say, something went awry in their life. They had a big setback, and now they're depressed. And so that's an area of overlap that's worth pointing out.
Mm-hmm.
If you've never had problems with attention or focus in your life, and now you've had a big setback of some kind, and now you're having trouble concentrating, but your mood is also low, and your self-esteem has taken a hit, and other things may be going on in your life, that may be ADHD, but it may also be not ADHD. It may be major depression or an anxiety disorder, one aspect of which can be to interfere with your ability to think clearly and concentrate and focus. And for some people, that's what they notice when they get depressed or are anxious.
Yeah, and I have seen, and I say this carefully, but I think I've seen a lot of people who were actually misdiagnosed, and I'm not sure how that happens. Maybe they didn't fully give a professional like yourself all the symptoms that they were experiencing, or their past history or what have you. But I have seen that somebody was misdiagnosed.
But to your original point, and to this point that you're making now, I also get the opposite sometimes, where somebody comes into my office who carries a diagnosis of anxiety or even depression, and who has never been diagnosed with ADHD. And in talking to them, it becomes clear to me that they have had a lifelong problem with focus, and but it's just never been discussed with them before. And sometimes I diagnose that person with ADHD for the first time in their life, and this would be an adult.
Yeah.
And I treat them for ADHD, and their anxiety issues or even some of their mood issues may dramatically improve in a way that has never happened before with an antidepressant drug, let's say, or some other drug that was given to them for, quote unquote, an anxiety disorder or recurrent depression. So there is overlap between these disorders. There are ways to distinguish between them, but you need to, as you say, have experience in making that differentiation. And honestly, a lot of even trained psychiatrists, especially depending on when they were trained, are a little bit blind to this. I myself wasn't really trained very much in the diagnosis or treatment formally of ADHD. It's just not something that when I was a resident in psychiatry or a medical student before that, ADHD was not really a diagnosis that was given a lot of, forgive the pun, but given a lot of attention by general psychiatrists who were adult psychiatrists. It's something that child psychiatrists, of course, were trained to look at, but adult psychiatrists really didn't consider ADHD as one of their main diagnostic categories. And so, for example, the mental status exam, which is kind of the physical exam equivalent in psychiatry, doesn't, although it has cognition as one of its components, most psychiatrists don't even ask patients about if they're having difficulties with attention. or if they've always had difficulties with attention and focus, except perhaps in the context, as I said, of a depression evaluation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so for that reason, I think in adults, ADHD has been underdiagnosed traditionally. The psychiatrist just didn't ask about it.
Yeah. And, and I've said this 100 times on this podcast that, I grew up in the 60s, and I don't think there was, I don't think I know, there was not a level of awareness, not only in the education system, but I think in the medical field, so to speak, that my parents had me go to a child psychologist, and if I look back, I don't think he really kind of totally understood me, and that's probably not uncommon, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
so now you have this strange dichotomy, I find, where in the pediatric realm, there is some concern, at least in some quarters, is this being overdiagnosed, or too many kids getting this diagnosis? Whereas in the adult population, in my own experience, it's the opposite. There's still, and it's because of what you're saying, there's this lag of people who were never diagnosed when they were children in the 60s or 70s or whatever. Now they're adults. They really do have ADHD. It's never been paid any attention to.
Yeah.
Whereas in the current pediatric population, again, depending, of course, on where you live and what part of the country you're in, and what the community practice standards are, it's quite common now for kids to get this diagnosis and to have an IEP and have attention paid to it in terms of how they're schooled, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. I want to loop back in a few minutes about what they call comorbid conditions.
Mm-hmm.
I hate that term, but I guess
Mm-hmm.
maybe you can give me a better term when we get to it. But I have always, I guess, said, or, when I had to, and again, I was an ADHD kid, and so it was always kind of on my radar, but never really, again, poor pun, but paid attention to my own kind of condition. But I was always told, or that dopamine was kind of the culprit when it came to ADHD, and it was what I had found the term an unregulated amount of dopamine that flowed to the proper parts of the brain. So,
Mm-hmm.
but can you kind of tell us what dopamine is and how it actually works in our brains?
I'll do my best. And I say that because and I didn't get into this much in my introduction, but I was trained as a neuroscientist. I worked as a neuroscientist for many decades. I ran a research lab. So, not to toot my own horn too much, but I'm fairly well qualified to talk about this sort of thing. But the reality is that our scientific understanding of how the brain works is still extremely limited. We know a lot, but the brain is so complicated in terms of its structure that even for everything that we know scientifically these days about the brain, which is quite a lot, especially compared to, let's say, 20 or 30 or let alone 50 or 100 years ago, it's still barely scratching the surface in terms of understanding how the brain does all the fantastic things it does in a human being.
Yeah.
So I can tell you what we know about dopamine and how it's related to ADHD, with that caveat. So
Yeah.
Dopamine, first of all, chemically, if you want to get down to that level, it's what's called a monoamine neurotransmitter, and it also, even more specifically, is a catecholamine neurotransmitter. And what that means is, chemically, it's derived from a single amino acid, tyrosine. Amino acids, you may recall, are the building blocks of proteins. There are 20 different amino acids that go into all the proteins in your body.
Yeah.
And so a monoamine neurotransmitter like dopamine is made from a single amino acid building block, tyrosine, and then that's chemically modified in your body to make different neurotransmitters, one of which is dopamine. And it's a chemical signal that is used in the nervous system to communicate between neurons. And that's true not just in human beings, that's true in all complex multicellular animals on Earth. So it's not a chemical that's specific to us Homo sapiens, but it's found in all animals, including your pet dog and cat, and even much, much more simpler animals than that.
That's interesting. I've never actually heard that it's not just us humans that have dopamine. That's
Sure.
that's interesting.
So in that regard, it's even possible in theory, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are pet psychiatrists who make this diagnosis for your dog to have ADHD, I suppose. And there may be some breeds of dog for whom that diagnosis might qualify. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and that means it's a chemical signal that's relayed between the brain cells, and the term for that is a neurotransmitter. And then in terms of what it does in the brain, there it gets much more complicated very quickly. So everything I've told you so far is actually quite simple and very, very well established. Now, when we start talking about what does dopamine do in the brain, it quickly gets a lot more complex because it doesn't do just one thing. There are many circuits in your brain, and many of them use dopamine as well as other neurotransmitters. And so it's not quite so simple to say, well, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's involved in attention. It is involved in that, and we know that because of, for example, how ADHD medications work. But dopamine also is involved in other circuits that do other things. So, for example, a lot of people these days are aware that dopamine is involved in the reward system.
Yeah.
And that's gotten a lot of attention, on the internet and elsewhere. There's this idea that dopamine is this pleasure chemical that your brain makes. And that's a vast oversimplification. It is involved in pleasure and reward, but that's not all it does. It's also involved in attention. It's involved in sensory processing. It's involved in motor control. And we know all those things in part because of basic neuroscience research about the circuitry of the brain, and in part actually because of what we know about the types of diseases that human beings get when the dopamine system goes awry. So, and those vary from Parkinson's disease, which is fundamentally a disease of too little dopamine in the brain.
Yeah.
And as most people know, Parkinson's disease involves problems with movement. People become very rigid or have abnormal movements. And that's the primary symptom that you get with Parkinson's. On the other hand, another disease that's associated with dopamine is schizophrenia. So if you have too much dopamine signaling going on in the brain, that can lead to psychosis, hallucinations, delusions. And so we know that because drugs that treat schizophrenia and disorders in psychiatry that involve hallucinations and delusions can be treated by giving people drugs that interfere with dopamine signaling. And we also know that because certain drugs of abuse, which dramatically increase dopamine, can lead to psychosis, can cause something that looks a little like schizophrenia. That is, it'll give people hallucinations and delusions.
Yeah.
So that's why it gets complicated very quickly. To give a short answer about what dopamine is and what it does in the brain, I can tell you what it is, but when we start talking about what it does, there are many things it does. One of the things it does, apparently, is contribute to the ability of people to focus and pay attention and even sit still and while they're doing that. And the evidence for that really comes from the fact that many ADHD medications do work by affecting dopamine.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there are artificial ways of generating dopamine. Now, you mentioned one of them. It's gotten a bad rap is social media. So Facebook likes and Instagram likes and all that. But, I think a lot of the ways that people who have thrived with ADHD have done that is through exercise and, mind and body and what have you, or just kind of finding their path in life, correct?
Right. So, to your point, any activity that gives you pleasure, that you find it pleasurable, especially if it's intensely pleasurable in the moment, is probably activating the reward pathway in your brain. And that relies on dopamine in part for its signaling. And so certainly any activity that is quote unquote addictive is likely to involve dopamine signaling. So when you do something pleasurable, or as you said, if you're kind of have internet addiction or social media addiction and, you love getting likes on your page, you could say, yes, every time you see one of those likes pop up, you're getting a little squirt of dopamine in your reward pathway. And that's why you feel that little rush of pleasure when you see that.
Yeah.
Other similar things that do the same thing would be sex, ice cream, chocolate, basically anything you can think of that people find intensely pleasurable and a little bit addictive is likely to be activating that reward pathway.
I understand the connection between, say, exercise or running or taking a walk or even, maybe meditation, where you're almost physically, you're approaching it from a physical point of view, and that is generating, like you say, neurotransmitters and what have you. What I and maybe you don't know the answer to this, maybe you do, but I mean, when somebody posts a picture of their cat on Instagram and all of a sudden they see 20 people liked it, I mean, I just don't quite, I mean, I understand that makes somebody happy, but how does that then tell the brain to generate this chemical?
Okay, so I think here it may be important again to make a slight distinction, because at least to me, the kind of increase in dopamine signaling that you see when somebody exercises or meditates, the first several things that you mentioned there, those sorts of activities, I think that's very likely qualitatively and quantitatively different than the kind of dopamine that we're talking about when you get some likes on the picture of your cat on the internet.
Yeah.
And that again has to do with the circuitry involved. So you're correct. Intense exercise will lead to some increases in dopamine signaling that's fairly generalized throughout your brain, including throughout your frontal cortex, which is where executive functioning happens. And we can get back to what that means later if you like.
Yeah.
And so that kind of generalized increase in dopamine signaling or dopamine efficiency that comes from overall physical activity, engaging in exercise for a prolonged period of time, or perhaps meditation of certain types, that is likely to be helpful for ADHD symptomatology to some degree. In other words, it may help you focus better if you have ADHD, at least for a period of time, much like an ADHD medication might.
Yeah.
On the other hand, activating the reward pathway by doing social media or eating ice cream or doing some of the other things I mentioned, I don't think that's going to lead to an improvement in your ADHD symptoms. Because what we're talking about is release of dopamine very specifically in this circuit in your brain that's involved in making something feel pleasurable and making it somewhat addictive.
Yeah.
So that's a very circumscribed release of dopamine in a very specific area of your brain. And that's actually and, and this again gets very complicated when we start talking about causality. But for lack of a better way of saying it, that causes you to, in fact, feel the pleasure and want to do it more.
Yeah.
So to deviate a little bit into a more of a research sort of direction, scientists know that, and they've known for many decades now, that in a rat, let's say, you can implant an electrode into that reward circuit in the brain and hook that up to a little switch, and that the rat can activate by pressing a lever in its cage. And rats will become addicted to doing that. In other words, just the action of hitting that switch in their cage to activate that electrical electrode and thereby turn on that reward pathway is in itself addictive. So we gather that to the rat, that must subjectively seem pleasurable. We can't prove that, of course. We can't ask the rat, but that's exactly the kind of behavior that mimics addiction in a human being. It's like any other form of addiction, and it responds in the same way to other kinds of interventions that we use for addiction. So it's one model of addiction, in other words, in an animal.
So I like to...
But just to finish that, because just to get back to your original question, I wouldn't expect rats that are pressing a lever in their cage and thereby activating that reward circuit in their brain and thereby getting those little pulses of dopamine just in that circuit. I wouldn't expect those rats to have better attention if you were to test them in some kind of rat test of ADHD. On the other hand, a rat that's been on an exercise wheel for a long time and exercised a lot, there we do see more generalized release of dopamine in the brain. And those rats might have an improvement in quote unquote ADHD type symptoms. Does that make any sense?
No, that actually makes perfect sense. It's almost just short-term reward. I can talk. Short-term rewards versus kind of long-term sustainable access to dopamine in certain ways. I mean,
right.
I'm not phrasing it like a doctor like you would, but
I think you're right. It has to do both with the length of time that dopamine is affected and also the location in the brain and how generalized it is. And it comes back to this original point I made, that dopamine does many, many things in the brain. So if you start thinking about it too simplistically, dopamine is the reward chemical. So if we do things that are rewarding, that's going to improve your focus. That breaks down pretty quickly, because that's actually not what's going on.
Yeah. So, and again, I've used this phrase that Dr. Hallowell has used is, find the right job and marry the right person. He says some of those keys to, managing or thriving with your ADHD. And I know that,
those are good rules for everybody.
Well, exactly. Whether you have,
not.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's kind of almost very simple rules to live by.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that, when you have the right career and you love what you do and you love going to work, I think those other things, maybe ADHD specific, tend to not show up as often. So because you're doing something you love versus a job you hate. So, and I don't want to go on the negative side of dopamine, but I like to tell people that I talk to, find your dopamine, find what makes you happy. And I think that can go a long way in, I know you could be an attorney, you could be a doctor, you could be a public relations person. It's just whatever kind of feeds that part of your brain. So
that's an interesting point. And I see where you're going with this. Right. So one I wouldn't necessarily call it a symptom, but one aspect of the ADHD personality, for lack of a better word, or an ADHD trait that we sometimes see, and it's not part of the official DSM criteria for making the diagnosis of ADHD. So that's why I'm reluctant to call it a symptom, but it is something that we see in both kids and adults with ADHD, is this tendency sometimes to what we call hyperfocus. And so it's an interesting and a little bit counterintuitive property of the ADHD brain that people with ADHD, while they may have a lot of difficulty focusing or paying attention in general, or to things that other people are able to sort of force themselves to pay attention to, or master the resources to pay attention to. So while ADHDers or people with ADHD may have difficulty doing that, they can focus very well if there's a task that they find intensely interesting or rewarding, relating to what we were talking about a minute ago.
Yeah.
And although I don't think it's well understood, I suspect that may have to do with what we were talking about a minute ago, because if you're focusing on an activity that you're very, very interested in, that basically means it's activating your reward system. Mm-hmm. It's activating that reward pathway. And this gets to your point. So if you're doing something that you love, or something that you find really quote unquote turns you on, that's way of terms, well, that's activating your reward pathway. And somebody who has ADHD, while they may have a deficit, quote unquote deficit of dopamine in certain parts of their brain, their reward pathway is probably working just fine. So they can still feel rewarded by doing something that they love. And that system, just like that rat pressing the bar, that still works. That's still addictive, if you will. And so even though somebody with ADHD may have trouble sitting still in a classroom, or paying attention to a lecture, or reading a long novel that somebody else without ADHD can get through, when they're doing something that they love, that turns on that reward pathway, that turns on that addiction pathway in their brain, that works fine, and they can focus very well on that. And sometimes they can do that even better than somebody without ADHD. And it probably has to do with the fact that it's even more rewarding for them, because that's a kind of reward that they don't get from these other activities. They don't, if you have ADHD, you have trouble sustaining your attention over a long period of time, doing what might be called delayed gratification. So, to use the example of, a simple example like a long novel, if you read War and Peace, okay, that only gets gratifying if you can get to the end.
Which is not something I think I could do.
Well, exactly. And that's exactly my point. You have to read that whole book before you get that squirt of dopamine, basically, or at least read several chapters before you finally get a little squirt of dopamine from Tolstoy. That says, oh, that's really cool. And that's activating your reward pathway. If you can't even get to that point, then of course you're just not going to be able to get through that book. You're going to read a few pages and toss it down, because it's just not doing it for you. So ADHDers don't get that kind of reward that other people without ADHD can get by engaging in activities that may come with reward, but with a delay. It takes a lot of effort to finally get that little squirt of dopamine in your brain that, oh, that was fun, that was rewarding. So for that reason, because they don't have that in their lives, anything that is instantly gratifying or that they find intensely gratifying is going to be even more, it's going to have an even greater draw. And I think that may be where the hyper-focus trait comes from, I suspect.
Yeah.
I can't prove it, but that's a hypothesis.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think it's important to point out that everyone has a reward system, whether you have ADHD or not.
Right.
Yeah.
ADHD is not a deficit in the reward system. That's basically what I'm saying. That part of your brain works just fine, and it may even be helpful, as you're saying, in the sense that when you are doing something that you find really pleasurable, you can focus on it. You can stick with it, and ADHDers do that very well.
Yeah. So I got one more question, and then I'm gonna actually ask if it's okay to have you back, because I have some other questions, and I know I sent you in advance that I
Mm-hmm.
know in our time here I'm not gonna get to, and I promised people we would talk about it. But I want to kind of wrap up, and then, like I said, you and I are gonna go offline and figure out how to
Mm-hmm.
set up another podcast here, because you've really
Sure.
got a great way of breaking this stuff down that people can understand. But you know, we've been on this theme about, finding things that you like and finding things that reward. So when you're in your practice and you're, uh, discussing these things with your patients or clients, what is the best way that you come up with to kind of help somebody just be true to themselves? Because I think that's, again, I'm going to use the phrase whether you have ADHD or not, because I think we all need to kind of do that. But how do you kind of walk somebody through just being true to themselves? Is, what, I want to go into public relations, or I want to go into banking, or I really want to learn how to hike this mountain, or do whatever the thing is or career is. But how do you kind of walk people through that process?
Well, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right that it's not specific to ADHD. That's a question that comes up in my office all the time with all kinds of different patients. So, but what I'm about to say, as I'm thinking about answering you, may especially apply to people with ADHD in terms of ways to approach that question.
Yeah.
So one thing that can be helpful is really to focus on your values and using that as a starting point. So, and it may even be helpful for people to write those down. So, what really is important to you in your life in the biggest sense of that, what matters to you? And then using that as a starting point, break it down a little further. Okay, given that those are your values, now let's talk about things that you'd like to do, things that you'd like to accomplish. And those can initially just be written down as they occur to you, but then go back to the core values and subgroup the list of things that you want to accomplish under each value. So in other words, how does that list of potential accomplishments or activities line up with your core values? Is this contributing to the most important value, which may be, having a family, or to some other value like being prominent in your career, for example? And I'm just making things up.
Mm-hmm.
There could be all kinds of ways that people might want to organize that. But through that process, then you can hopefully start to prioritize what really matters to you. What do you really want to do? And that can then give you some clarity on exactly what you're saying, finding, quote unquote, yourself. Because I think for everybody, everybody has difficulties from time to time, at least, with distractions. In life, we all have distractions, and it's easy to get distracted. And another way of saying that is to lose touch with what really matters to you.
Yeah.
And whether you have ADHD or not, as adults certainly, but also kids, we all experience this. We get distracted by these little things, these little nuisances or other tasks, and they can consume us. And then pretty soon we're spending all our time just taking care of these little tasks, these little peripheral things, and the thing that we really want gets pushed aside. And that's another way of saying what you were bringing up, which is how do you get back in touch with what really matters to you? How do you get back in touch with what you really want to do with your life? Which is, of course, a different way of saying, how do you get in touch with your true self? What you asked. And so I think centrally that comes down to a process of looking at what you're actually spending time on versus what you're actually trying to accomplish versus what are your core values in life. And then going through the trouble of realigning those things, which means making a decision not to do things that are distractions and instead to refocus on tasks and items in your day that actually contribute to the main goals and the main values that you have. And that's something that we all need to do from time to time. It's a kind of recalibration that all people need to do. Some people are better than others at doing it. And I think to a great degree, that's independent of whether or not you have ADHD. For people with ADHD, that might be a little harder because the distractions can accumulate so much faster. And to that degree, it may be even more challenging to stay in touch with, well, what really matters to me? I'm spending my entire day running around doing all these other tasks that just keep consuming me and that are coming from all different directions. What is it that I really want to do? And then recalibrating your day and your activities of the day to focus on the things that really matter.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it a minute ago, is also, what do I not want to do? I mean, and I think that's, and I think there's kind of two parts to that. Is maybe it's learning how to say no in certain situations, which a lot of us are not good at, and then we set ourselves up, and then the person that we promise something to for failure. But I also think it's when, say, you're looking at a career, and I know in the past decade or so, where technology and what have you, I think careers have changed at a rapid pace. And you might have people saying, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And this part of my career isn't what I signed up for. So there are certain, like you say, values. There are certain things that I don't want to do anymore. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Say Anything. I think it was it John Cusack, but he goes to dinner with his girlfriend, and the father says, "What do you want to do with your life?" And he goes, I don't want to sell anything bought. I don't want to buy anything sold. I don't want to sell anything processed, bought, sold. I mean, he goes to this list of things that he actually doesn't want in his life. So I just thought that was kind of funny. But I think that's an important distinction, is like you say, just make a list of what you don't want.
Yes. Well, and so one idea that I have found helpful was pointed out to me by one of the co-authors on the book that I wrote with my wife, Sarah. And the third author is Peter Johnson, who's a martial artist. And he brought up that the etymology of the word decision. So what we're talking about is making decisions in your life. And there are big decisions and there are small decisions. Big decisions, by that I mean, deciding what you want to do with your career. That's a big decision. But then every day we have lots of little small decisions like, am I going to do this errand right now, or am I going to keep working on my homework, or am I going to keep, working on this task that I need to get done for my business? Or am I going to go run to the grocery store right now or get gas or whatever? And each one of those little decisions affects our productivity during the day. But the word decision is interesting. What he pointed out to me is that the roots of decision come from Latin, meaning scission is a root that means cutting. So, for example, incision in surgery, that means to cut into something. Okay. Decision means to cut away from something. So the point is that when you make a decision, to your point, you're cutting something away. And it's very interesting that, because I didn't really think of decision in that way before. I thought of making a decision as, deciding to do something. But as you said, it also involves deciding not to do something else.
Yeah.
And so the word actually means cutting something off.
Yeah.
So really, when you make a decision, although we tend to think of it in the positive sense of, well, you're deciding what you want to do, you're also deciding what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And that involves, as you said, saying no. It involves, or at least putting off those tasks that are less important.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
It is hard, and I think, and I'll wrap it up, but I think a lot of people with ADHD, and again, we're not the only ones, but have that decision fatigue. We wonder what we're going to wear in the morning. We go look in our closet and we're like, is it blue? Is it brown? Should I wear a sweater? So it's a constant struggle. How can people find you? And again, I'm gonna have you back because there's some things that I promised to talk about that we just kind of ran out of time. But how can people find you?
Well, I have a blog, and so you can look that up on Psychology Today. In terms of where I work, I work in the San Francisco Bay Area for the Palo Alto Medical Foundation. You could find me there. I think if you Google me, you'll find me there, and you'll also find links to my career as a professor at UCSF. But at this point, I'm working in full-time practice. So it's really at the Palo Alto Medical Foundation in San Carlos, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And again, we're gonna do round two very soon. But I thought you've provided a lot of value and tools and insight to people. So thank you so much.
It was my pleasure to be here, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
That's it, folks. Another edition of Overcoming Distractions, the podcast, has come to an end. Hope you're inspired. Hope you've learned something. Check overcomingdistractions.com for more podcasts, video blogs, and up-to-date info on books and more books. We'll catch you on the next one.